Okay, thank you everybody. You are attending today's webinar and it's on digital project fundamentals. And I'm Rachael Woody and I'm here with Andretta Schellinger from Schellinger Research. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for including me.
So quick note about me for those who may not know, I am Rachael Woody. I own a consulting firm that serves libraries, archives, and museums. And much like our topic today, a lot of my focus and services are on digital collections management. And so that's specializing in digitization technology, project management, and digital usership. And also have quite a bit of experience across my career that has dealt with launching multiple digital projects, working with really cool technology and different collaborative portals. And with me today is Andretta.
Hi, so my name is Andretta Schellinger, and I am the co-owner of Schellinger Research, and I serve individuals, libraries, archives, museums, and companies. And I do the implementation of digitization projects, and I specialize in technology, creation of digitization projects, and the completion. So I'm more of the hands-on. I do help organizations create the project, but I also do full scope scanning.
So, a couple housekeeping items before we get started. This session is pre-recorded so that we could deliver a lot of information very efficiently, and we will be available when this premieres in the Q&A box to answer any of your questions. A link to this recording and a link to all of the resources that we mention will be sent out in an email to you for those who registered. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the notes section. And if you're here for the premiere, please feel free to share questions, comments, your own experiences as we go along. And just a note to please remember and respect that the content that Andretta and I are sharing here today is our intellectual property and not to violate or disrespect that. And just one other note here, you can go into full screen or closed captioning. This is a YouTube premiere, and so you can view it either here in the webinar room or over on my YouTube channel. Either way, you should be able to pull up the auto captioning and the full screen options. Okay, what we're going to cover. So we're going to kick this off talking about digital projects on like a macro level, and I'm going to break it down for you in terms of how to do an assessment and determine where you even start in terms of selecting a digital project, how to prioritize it, and then how to construct it. And then I'm going to hand it over to Andretta.
And I will be talking about the more micro on what equipment, resolution, the file formats, and the naming conventions once you are ready to start digitizing.
And then we're both going to sort of tag team and tackle the digital project realities. And part of that is thinking about storage needs, access, and then, of course, the challenges that usually arise when we talk and work with digital projects. So we're going to offer some solutions and advice around those for you to implement back at your home base. And then, of course, at the end, share resources. So getting into digital projects, first, I recommend, if you have the time and the space, to conduct a collection assessment and evaluate what digital collections you already have. For some of you, you may not have any, so you're starting from zero, and that's fine. Others, you may have inherited, digital projects done before you, or maybe you've done a few on your already yourself, but you're not sure where to go next. And particularly when we're in a time where we're thinking about trying to make our collection holdings more inclusive in the stories that they tell and offering more representation of what our collections are and online, as well as physically in exhibits, it's really important to be purposefully evaluative of what's been done and have that help inform what you're doing next. And some guided questions to think about when you're in this part of the process is the quality of the digital files that you have currently acceptable? For many of us who inherit inherit a digital collection, they could have been scanned 10 plus years ago and maybe at like 100 DPI instead of 600 DPI. Things like that. So it may be worth reevaluating and reinvesting in digitizing those at better quality and at better standards. Another question to think about is the catalog information correct and does it meet best practices? So if you've digitized items in your collection and you've cataloged and put them online, do those meet best practices, both in terms of whether it's Society of American Archivists or ICOM best practices, or even internal practices. But for many of us, if we're inheriting something from earlier, it usually doesn't always meet our current standards. Then think about, does the current collection management system content provide a representative sample across all collection areas? For many of us, especially if we're working with grant-funded projects, it's sort of piecemeal in terms of what collections get more or less representation. So where are there collection areas that maybe haven't received that attention, and address those? And then, of course, are there any other descriptive or access points of improvement you can make, whether that is the content itself or the way you're delivering, managing, storing it, etc.? So once you've done that assessment process, you will probably come up with more than one project idea. And so the next part is prioritizing, because many of us don't have unlimited resources and staff to do these things. And so we really need to think about how to choose what happens next. So the guided questions I have here are: which items are completely hidden? So thinking about those collection areas that maybe haven't been digitized yet and not online or anywhere that could be accessed, how can you put a representative sampling of images online for them? Which items are in danger of disappearing? And disappearing is sort of a non-alarmist word for which ones are deteriorating at a very scary rate, or may not be able to be digitized for much longer. So I'm thinking of negatives, where the emulsion on the negative is deteriorating at such a rate you're not going to be able to scan it again. So thinking about those things in terms of urgency, what are items that are at most risk? Another way to look at this is which items are more frequently used. For us, especially when we're the caretakers of collections, we want to try and minimize as much harm as possible to our collection. And one of those ways is to think about the items that get pulled out the most, whether that's pulled out for display, reference, etc. Which items could really benefit from having a digital representative available for some of those events. The next item to think about is getting into that diversity and representation mindset, and that's thinking about which items can provide increased representation. So whether that's increased representation of the community around you, increased representation to help balance out what sort of collections and communities you have represented in your exhibit, those kinds of things. And then, of course, which items can support current projects or museum efforts. So, maybe your museum is hitting a centennial of some event, and so it makes sense to be proactive and digitize things that will likely be requested for those events, press release, etc. Or perhaps the museum just went through some new strategic planning, and so you've adjusted your mission, and now there are projects that make sense to help support whatever that new strategic plan is. Now thinking about project construction, and I know all of us are subject matter experts versus project managers, but if ever you have a chance to take a project management class, I highly recommend it. And so here's just like a outline of thinking about creating your project with some project management principles in mind. So the very first thing I recommend you do is, once you've gone through that assessment and prioritization of the projects, for those that are at the top, articulate what your need is. For many of us as collection managers, we know that these things are important, and we assume that everybody else also knows that these items are important and that it's important to digitize. But we actually need to make sure that we are articulating that need and being very clear with everyone, especially resource allocators, as to why we need to do this digitization project. And then, of course, the next thing that you're going to need to figure out is what are the outcomes. And so for outcomes, for us, we'll immediately think of, okay, well, I've digitized 100 items and I've put them online. That's the outcome, which is a good one. It's more a product deliverable, though. And I want to challenge you all to think about outcomes as something more intangible and think about some of those questions I asked you earlier. Will this project help you build better representation in your collections? Will this project help preserve the items because you've digitized them and removed them from frequent use? Those are outcomes, and those are what are really going to speak to grant acquisition, grant reviewers, your executive director, donors and funders, etc. Next, you're going to have to determine resources. So, depending on the scope of your project, you'll have to figure out, do you have the equipment necessary or the software? Do you need to bring someone in to help you do it? Those types of questions, and really articulating what sort of resources you need, because you will likely need to go and either ask a donor or a granting agency, et cetera, to get that money. And then the next part, I want you to think about what sort of level of descriptive standards you want to use. So what fields will you use when you catalog these items? What thesauri are you going to use? That type of thing. Because if you are writing a grant, you are definitely going to need to include that. And even if you're not, that's something to identify ahead of time before you begin the project. And then, of course, construct that digitization equation. And I know this is something we've chatted about before, and I'll drop a link resource for you coming up. But think about the time it's going to take either you or a vendor or a student employee, whoever is going to do the digitization and cataloging work. You will need to craft an equation that will outline how long will it take me to prepare this object. So whether that's removing it from storage and putting it on the scanner, or removing it and sending it to a vendor, maybe it has to get some conservation. What does that look like? And then, of course, the digitization itself, whether you are using an Epson scanner at the office or you're working with a vendor, get some of those digitization timeframes in place, especially dependent on what types of items you are digitizing. That will also impact how long it takes. Then, of course, you're going to need to think about file management, the resource or research you need to do to learn about that object so that you can then catalog and write that descriptive data, and then the reviewing and the publishing to whatever platform you use. So with all of that in mind, calculating the time it will take you, your staff, working with a vendor, and bringing out that whole timeline from starting to ending. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andretta to talk about digitization.
Thank you. So, once you get through your project and you get the funding, then you start looking at equipment. And once you start looking at equipment, you'll notice there are options, so many options for everything. And so, the first thing to look at is, what materials are you scanning or digitizing? Do you only have newspaper articles, or do you have a combination of audio, visual, photos, paper? And so once you get that material list down, you can start looking at the options. Expensive does not always equal good. And what I mean by that is, when you start looking for scanners, you'll see ones that are thousands of dollars, but they do not offer anything that you can't get for cheaper. So you've now decided that you want scanners or other implements to help digitize your resources. Look for used first. And the reason is because, like you, other organizations have digitized their materials and then they don't need that equipment anymore. And so, to help bring back some funds, they are looking to possibly either rent out that equipment or to sell it. Buy what you need, not what you want. And what I mean by that is, it can look great, but do you need it? If you have one project with 4 VHS tapes, do you need to spend the money on 2 VCRs? Um, and then getting down to hardware. So for hardware, my personal recommendations is for a feed scanner. A great option is the Epson ES400. It runs about $250, but I have used mine for 5 years now, and I've never had an issue with it. For if you only have photos and no slides, the LIDE by Canon,
Mm.
the 300 or 400 is a great option. They run from $70 to $90, and they may not look great and they might not be, robust, but they do everything you need them to do. If you have photos and slides and you need something a little bigger than the LIDE, the Epson V600, it's $230, but it does slides, it does photo negatives, it does photos, it also does papers. So it encompasses all that you may need from a flatbed without needing multiple. And then my favorite for maps or delicate items is the CZUR ET16. It stands up, so it's more of a downward facing scanner. And it's great for very delicate documents that you don't want on a flatbed that could be, pressed between the top and the glass. So those are good hardware as a basic. Software, most come with a built-in software that is free with the purchase of the scanner, and they are the best for what you need. Uh, there will be a lot of companies saying, oh, you need our additional software, but you don't. Uh, Adobe is needed if you want to combine paper documents into packets, depending on what your needs are. And for films, I actually suggest OBS, which is a software used by game streamers. And the reason is it's free and it has a lot of options to help you take a media and change it to what you need. And then one thing to think about with equipment is your project. So as Rachel said earlier, look at your project and decide what you're going to scan and what your priorities are. So if you pick a project that has one VHS tape or one slide or only, under 100 slides, it may not be worth buying the equipment versus contracting out to someone who already has the equipment. In the long run, it will be most cost effective for your organization. So you get your equipment and you have your project and you're ready to actually scan. And one of the questions that the software will ask is, what resolution do you want? So a couple of things to consider with this is what the intended goal of your project is. Do you just want to have these documents saved? Do you want to display them either by printing or, print one of the images and put it on a library wall? Or do you want to put it forward facing for historians and other archivists to be able to see the product? And why this is important is because it is determining what is it going to be expanded? Do you want to blow it up? And if that, then you need a higher resolution. Another thing is audience. Who's going to see this? Who do you want to see this? Do you want this to be publicly available for authors to put in their books or historians to use? And if so, the higher DPI, the better. Because then if a historian uses your image in their book, when it's printed, it's not going to look really blurry. And the last really important, probably one of the most important, is what is your available space for storage? And the reason that this is important is because as you increase the DPI, it's going to take up more space. So if you have a finite space or a large project that you do not feel you can scan everything or digitize everything to store it, then you have to look at the first two, your intended goal and your audience. And that will actually even go back to prioritizing. What is your goal? Who is your audience? And so here's an example. The original image is a 2" by 3". And as you can see at 400 zoom, at 300, 600, and 1200, there's a big difference in what it looks like. And while that might not be important if you just have your images online for people to view, if you want someone to be able to use that, then you're going to need to increase it. So in my professional opinion, nothing should be under 600 DPI for photos. Black and white paper can be at 300. But once you start adding in color and other elements, then you need to bump it up to 600 to be able to get the longevity and the viewability that you want. So format. So you scan and then you save and it asks you what your format you want to be in. And I may sound like a broken record, but also things to consider is intended goal. What do you want to do with this? Do you want this just to be saved so people can view it inside your facility and your organization? Or do you want it to be forward facing? Audience is really important because if you want people to be able to take a photo and go print it at a Walmart or another organization, there's certain formats that you can't use for that. Available space. Some formats take up more space than others, which is good because those formats that take up more space tend to be better quality and stay around longer. Longevity. How long do you want this resource to be around? Hopefully a long time. But if you use proprietary software, the minute that that company or organization goes out of business, you might not be able to view that document anymore. And then usability. This goes back to your audience. How do you want to use it? Do you want just to store it, or do you want people to be able to access it? And so, again, in my professional experience and opinion for papers, I scan everything in TIFF and then I combine them into a PDF. So I have TIFF copies, but for storage, and then for forward-facing usability, a PDF. And what's nice about a PDF for newspaper articles and other documents is it's OCR, so you can search. So if you're a researcher, you can search for a certain topic or a certain individual versus going through 10,000 scans. Also for photos, if you want long-term storage, TIFF is great. However, if you want them to be able to be printed, you also have to put them in JPEG. So in a lot of cases, you're gonna have duplicate copies, one for storage and preservation and one for forward-facing accessibility. And then naming conventions. How do you name the things? Intended goal. Are you putting it on a CMS, DAMS? Or do you plan on just having a folder with documents that people have to search through? What platform are you going to put it on? Are you going to put it on a platform that can be accessed through the internet? Or is it location specific? Or is it individual specific? how the document will be assessed. Will it only be for storage, long-term storage, so you don't lose that document? Or will everyone be able to look at it at any time? And consistency. However you start your project, carry through. And what I mean by that is if you start a project that's a month long, 15 days in, don't decide to change the name. Because if you do, then whoever you have doing the final, assessing and putting it in and researching is going to be confused. So here are some examples. Collection name. So if you have a specific collection of newspaper articles that all have to do with paddle boats, you name it paddle boats, and then the X's are the number of scan. If you're doing a photo project and you have specific photographers, you can store it by photographer's name. And that also makes it easily searchable. If you are scanning a book, which we will get into that later, if you are scanning a book, the author, book title, and then page. With some archives, you have just boxes of information. So you scan it, box, number, and then the numbers after that are auto-populated by your scanning software. And then video recording and audio recording, simply name it the name of the video or recording. That makes it easily searchable. And it makes it easy for if someone comes in 2 years later to put it into a CMS, if it wasn't already, then they can say, oh, okay, this is that photographer.
All right, now we're going to get into digital project realities. And this is a section, I don't know if fun is the right word, but Andretta and I we very easily came up with like common things we have come up against and want to like help prepare you for. So the first one to definitely think about is storage. And as Andretta mentioned, you have the original files, which are usually like the big, pristine, perhaps it's a TIFF file as like the original file. And then there's the work files, the worker bees, where it's like maybe it needs to then be a JPEG so I can go to Costco and print it, or maybe it has to be a JPEG because that's a lesser file size to then put in my collections management system. So thinking about file size, file storage, and the complications that may arise depending on your situation. Thinking about multi-location storage, this is getting into some digital preservation best practices, which there's a link on this slide to reference for much more information about that. But thinking about multiple locations, whether that is on your computer and then on somebody else's computer across the United States, or whether that is on your computer but also in the cloud, which then also backs up across the United States, making sure you have at least more than just your computer for storing these files, because I can't tell you how many hearts have been broken and tears have been shed because projects were being done and saved just on one computer, and then that computer dies and they are irretrievable. So please don't be a broken heart story. And which goes nicely into my backups bullet point and revisioning. It's important to make sure that, especially if you're in a very active digitization phase, that you're backing up daily, and depending on how many scans, maybe even hourly, in terms of making sure it's not just on your computer, but also maybe backing up to the cloud or an external hard drive, something. Just please be careful about that. And then also keeping in mind revisioning or file versioning is another way to think about it. And this is another digital preservation piece to keep in mind, is when we create files, every time we open them, they are changed. Whether we purposefully change them or not, there's a little bit of an access cost. And so thinking about having that original pristine file that is untouchable, and then also creating that supplemental worker bee access copy is a very good practice to have, especially if digital preservation is important for your particular organization. And then, of course, security to access data on these files or with these files, who has access, what are the points of access, is there security that you need to worry about or not? And that's usually a larger conversation with whatever your larger parent organization is.
One thing that I would like to add actually about the revisioning is if you are planning on doing any photo or video manipulation,
Mm.
make sure that you have that original, because once you revise it and change the color or cut pieces out of a video, you can't get that back.
Yep. Thank you for mentioning. And that has definitely happened to younger Rachel,
Yeah,
naive past Rachel. Yes.
same thing. So,
Okay. I'm pretty sure we have like a club or something.
yeah.
All right. Thinking about access points, which is something that Andretta and I have both alluded to now, and that is you go through this great digitization process. If your part of your intended goal was to do that, to provide access to these images or movies or files or what have you, how are you doing that? Usually it is through a collections management system or CMS. And originally, even just a few years ago, there was a big difference between a CMS and a DAMS, or a digital asset management system. With the two, and as I've outlined on the slides, the collection management system primarily used to be about collecting the item information about the collection, mostly text based, until we could finally start adding digital surrogates of these items. And the digital asset management system traditionally was all about just storing those digital files, maybe doing some digital file preservation, and it was just about storage, not really about access. Now we're getting a bit of a crossover across these products, in terms of maybe you have a collections management system, but now you're able to do text with image. Now you're able to do a collections management system that publishes online instead of just the internal card catalog. And for digital asset management systems, they are starting to offer public access, or delivery mechanisms for things that are stored in the dams. And some examples of this come from Silicon Valley: Google Drive, Dropbox, products that are able to function primarily as just asset storage. You can also now share, collaborate, publish online, that type of thing. So my point of bringing this up is to highlight some of the differences, but to also highlight that at this point, depending on what your needs are, you may only need one because it does most of what you need. And I definitely have a different webinar on that that you can check out later. But for our purposes now, you've got options. And so we definitely wanted to address that nothing is permanent, and thinking about why is it that we digitize. And what I want to share with this one is all of the things that have been created for the most part is organic. So paper is an organic material, photos and negatives, the emulsion process, etc. All of those items, because they are of organic material, they are going to deteriorate at some point. And similarly, even though we are digitizing things, digital is not forever. And so we're not sure how long digital is going to be. But files can get corrupted, lost. I mean, see previous slide on storage. And so we really need to think about, what does permanent really mean, and how can we protect both physical and digital in its permanency. And related to this, of course, is disaster events, whether that is man made disasters or natural disasters, which can damage our items that are both physical and digital. So, trying to do the best we can in anticipating damage events and trying to put solutions and strategies in place when those do happen.
And then another thing is when you digitize, you have to look at what you're digitizing. So if you do it and then you have a death in the family, they were alive to help you determine who was in the photos. But if you wait and say, oh, I can do it later, or not just family and friends, but also important community members, if you wait, their stories can't be told in the same way. And improved for Schellinger research, especially improved accessibility. And I know that Rachael Cristine Consulting is also about improved accessibility. Making sure that people from across the US or across the world who might not have the funds or ability to travel to see documents, they now can. And preserving history with the records being destroyed either because of disaster or just over time, that history is gone and it's impossible to get back. And so by digitizing, you are saying, I find history important and I find this person's story or this town's story or organization story important enough to save it.
Mhm. And I think this is an excellent sort of case in point for us who are working in the field. We know how important these items are and how important digitization is for preserving them and providing access. And so for the many times that we hear from people who don't know better, okay, well, if you digitize it, you can just throw it away, right? Like after you're done, like we need the space. And that, like, oh, please don't. And so if you encounter that, use this slide and explain nothing is permanent, including digital, and nothing should be thrown away. Maybe in extreme circumstances, like I guess I can't say never, but that is why it is important to keep the original physical item
Yes,
and have a digital.
completely agree. Never get rid of anything, even if you put it in a back room because you don't want people to touch it, which further degrades the records, and you have them digital, still have those as a backup because that's still history.
Mhm.
And if something happens to your digital file, you still have those.
Yes. All right, the next one, hearing from people, well, why can't you just digitize it all? So we did want to acknowledge that it is an impossible Sisyphean task if we were to digitize it all. And also, like, you shouldn't. There are cases where you shouldn't digitize. And so, what I would love for you to keep in mind when you come up against this is to think about just like the time and the funding constraints that exist for you and how that those alone render it practically impossible to digitize all of your collections. And I know Andretta has a couple points to share with you there too.
So, one thing to look at is current accessibility versus envisioned. So, if you have everything accessible to everyone right now in physical form, but certain things are never checked out or never looked at, is that something that needs to be prioritized? Does it need to be scanned? Is there a reason why it hasn't been digitized or accessed by people? And then one of the most important things is copyright. So you have to look at, are things copyrighted? Does the photographer still own the copyright? And they might not or do not want you to make their collections accessible to all. This falls more into like books than photos, but you still have that. And so, one thing to remember is if you do look at a collection, to get permission from the owner if it's not owned by your organization.
All right, another challenge is cost, of course. There is the digitization hardware and software that Andretta walked us through in her section, and then also thinking about the collections management system or DAMS system that you're getting. There's the one-time setup, the configuration, the migration, and then license to use it, license to store it, any sort of customization you need. Andretta, I realized I just said your bullet point. Would you like to add to it?
So one thing is to look at storage cost as well. How much does that cost and for how long? Some storage is relatively inexpensive, while other storage versus in-house versus out of house, cloud versus physical. There's a lot of things to look out for costs for storage specifically. Digitization hardware, the equipment, and the software. There's software that is as good or better that's free or cheap than the paid versions. And so definitely look at all of your options regarding hardware and software before making a decision.
Thinking about the CMS and the dams cost a little bit further, there's then the annual costs and just a quick snapshot for you to think about. And there is another webinar for this as well. There's the free to low cost options, which you can get of some great utility depending on your own skills and knowledge and comfort in working with those tools. Many of them can be $0 to like $3,000-ish dollars. Lower cost products like off the shelf from a vendor, it can be about 5,000 to 7,500. If you start getting into the moderate costs, it's because you're typically a larger organization, more collections. Maybe it's like two organizations and you need a collaborative portal. That starts getting into the $10,000 to $20,000 a year range. And then if you are large, multi-institutional, terabytes of things, thousands of records, tens of thousands of records, it's then you start looking at, maybe it's the same product, but it's a much more bigger, robust product to contain your collection. And those can get up to about 50,000. So if you don't already have a CMS or DAMs in place, it is important to think about the costs as you start heading that direction. And then to leave you with some resources, because we realized we did cover quite a bit, we're going to offer some sustainability tips, and a resource for this one is actually by a colleague, Margot Note. She has some Demystifying Archival Projects ebook available. And thinking about projects and wanting to keep sustainability in mind, because I think it's fair to say that all of us don't have all the resources we wish we had for these projects. So be smart. And here's some guided questions for you. Does this project still align with the museum or archive's mission and strategic plan? What are the real-time costs, and are there enough resources in place? What quantity of digital output is anticipated and on an annual basis? What are the staff costs associated with that output? And at what rate should the museum or archives anticipate technology upgrades? Or perhaps downgrades, depending on if they need to get a VHS player. And then can the museum's budget accommodate the one-time costs that we talked about, especially for something like storage? And then, of course, does this project need to be right-sized? So maybe the scope is too big or too ambitious, and it requires too much staff or vendor time. Maybe we need to scale it down a bit. So thinking about all those things, whether the project's for a year or 10 years, and being able to sort of pace yourself accordingly. And then, of course, because this does cost money, just a quick note that there are resources available to learn more about grants. These grants in particular listed, and that will be shared in the email you get the next day, are great grants to look at for digitization type projects. I also have an ebook and a grant writing toolkit. Both are free and available through these links. And so if you haven't gotten them yet, I encourage that you do so, because they can help specifically get funding for these digitization projects, whether you're doing it in-house or need to send it out of house. And then, of course, when do you need to consider working with an expert? Both Andretta and I are experts in our field. And so we have a couple things to keep in mind. My recommendation is, especially if you're thinking about digital projects, if it's been a while since you last worked on a digital project, it may be worth bringing in an outside expert to assist. And the same is true if there isn't enough like time or availability from yourself or staff to do it. That is also another excellent reason to help bring in some help for that specific project. The next couple I think are Andretta's. I'll let her speak to.
So some digitization needs an expert in like video, VHS or 8 millimeter. And if there's not the availability, then sometimes it's good to go out versus spending that time to try to learn that platform, to go and bring in an expert that can either lead or do it if you don't have the time. And then if you can't or don't want to purchase equipment or software on a per project basis, then a vendor makes much more sense. And what I mean by that is a perfect example is a VCR. They don't make them anymore. And so they're becoming harder and harder to find. So if your project has two VHS and you really want those digitized, then it's good to look out at a vendor because that time to acquire the equipment, to maybe learn the equipment and get the software, you can have it at the vendor and back by then.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Another thing to think about is having someone lead you through that process from beginning to end, especially if it is a large digitization project, and wanting to sort of limit and protect staff time, protect them from overwhelm. That is another great reason to do so. And then if you need outside expertise, even if you have in-house expertise, this unfortunately is a common problem or atmosphere that exists where there is in-house professionals, but sometimes the higher ups won't listen as well to the in-house professionals as they would to an outside professional. So sometimes for that reason alone, it's great to bring someone in just to help get that allyship and have the message be heard by whoever needs to hear it.
And one other thing is protect your staff's time. And so it may not seem like it would take a lot of time to scan something, but it takes more time than one expects.
Mm.
And so if you need to bring in an expert to say, this is going to take X number of hours, so you can allocate staff for that, or even think about maybe bringing on a staff member just for that, that is also really helpful for your organization instead of trying to muddle through if you don't know the process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, excellent point. Since we did talk about CMS, I also have a CMS book. If that's a direction you're headed, it's definitely worth picking it up because this particular one will walk you through the selection and procurement process. So grab that if you need it. And then Andretta and I did cover a couple different resources throughout the slides. Here is another slide for great resources that didn't quite fit in. And again, you'll get all of this via email, so don't feel like you have to frantically write it down, but you have a copy in the slide deck as well. And then just some more free resources available for you, particularly the YouTube channel. I have several of the CMS webinars that we did a couple months ago that we referenced throughout the webinar, so you can check those out. And then this is my contact info. I know you'll have it from attending the webinar and you'll get it again tomorrow. I do want to give you Andretta's contact info, who is our guest today. And we are going to leave time for questions. It looks like we have 10 minutes, which Andretta and I weren't sure if we would have any time. So we did great. And I'm going to leave this slide up, and Andretta and I are going to do finish up our Q&A that's been happening in the chat for the next 10 minutes. So make sure you get this written down, and we'll send it out in the email as well. And Andretta, I just want to thank you so much for partnering with me on this topic. There's definitely been a lot of interest, as so many of us this last year have been tasked to do more increased digitization projects. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.